Maria had gone into a complete panic when she saw her neighbor lying in a muddy puddle. She needed to save him, but how? But Maria's concern quickly turned to suspicion, because when she found out why her neighbor had dove into the puddle like that, she immediately called the police. There was something very strange going on here. When they arrived, the puddle had already been completely drained by Maria and the other people. There was no sign of the neighbor's body, which had supposedly been lying face down in it. But there was something else on the bottom of the puddle. When the officers saw it, they drew their weapons and ordered Maria to stand back. They could not believe she had been telling the truth. But what was at the bottom of the police? What had happened to Maria's neighbor, and why did the police have to get involved? Before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Maria tried her best to help out in the neighborhood and be nice to everyone she met. She didn't pry into anyone's business or gossip about others, but something about her neighbor George made her start paying more attention to his actions. She just couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with him. Maria didn't know much about George, but she noticed that he was suddenly keeping unusual hours. He always seemed to be out in his garden working. It looked like he was trying to dig something up, but it was taking days and days. Plus, George's garden was a complete mess. In the past, he'd had a beautiful garden, but now it was half flooded and full of mud. It didn't look like any kind of gardening technique she'd ever heard of, and there weren't any materials to suggest that he was building anything out there. Maria finally decided to ask around to see if anyone else knew what was going on. She texted a few of the other neighbors, but none of them could answer her questions about why George was destroying his garden. In fact, some of the neighbors were even angry about it. Some people felt that George's flooded garden and yard were ruining the neighborhood's appearance. Maria wanted to give George the benefit of the doubt, but none of it made sense. Things got even worse when Maria looked out her window one afternoon to see that George was acting even stranger than before. George had stopped digging and expanding the hole in his garden. Instead, he was standing next to the hole and staring into the enormous puddle. He was taking deep breaths and seemed to be preparing himself for what he was about to do. Maria couldn't figure out what he was doing. Maria gasped and almost dropped her phone. She couldn't understand why George was crawling into the hole. There was so much mud and water that she could barely tell what he was doing or whether he was moving. His entire upper body was in the hole. Maria hung up and ran to George's house as quickly as possible. George had been acting strangely and dodging her questions about what he was doing in the garden, but she wanted to make sure he was safe. She was looking at his feet, hoping that they would move or give some sign of life. As Maria reached George's yard, she hoped she would be strong enough to pull him out of the puddle if he was in danger. But before she could even reach the garden, she saw George's body slipping away and sinking even deeper. Then, as she sprinted closer, George completely disappeared beneath the water. When Maria looked down at the hole, she saw bubbles of air rising and knew that George was still alive. But with that many bubbles, he had to be out of air. She reached into the mud but couldn't feel anything just below the surface. She was going to have to get into the water. Maria was nervous about getting into the water, but she knew that she was the only one capable of finding George down there before he ran out of air. She sat down at the edge of the hole and stuck her foot into the water. She didn't feel anything. How far down did it go? Instead of slowly lowering herself into the water, Maria decided that it was best to jump in at once. She slid into the mud and water, trying not to think about anything except for saving George's life. Her foot slammed into a hard surface at the bottom, twisting her ankle, but she definitely didn't feel George anywhere around her. Maria kicked out with both legs and leaned down to feel in the water closer to the surface. She couldn't find George. All she could feel was the hard surface at the bottom. And if she had only fallen in down to her waist, how had George completely sunk into the hole? Maria started to wonder if maybe she hadn't truly seen George's body go into the water. Maybe she'd misunderstood somehow. But then she thought about the air bubbles on the surface. Those had obviously come from George. As more time passed, Maria's panic only increased. There was only so long that George could hold his breath under the water. Maria started screaming in fear and frustration. Other neighbors noticed that something was going on and ran over to see if they could help. They weren't sure why Maria was standing in the hole, but they'd all watched George acting strangely and figured it was related somehow. What they found shocked them. Maria tried to explain what she'd seen. The neighbors could have blown her off or told her that she was just imagining things. But everyone knew that Maria wasn't the kind of person to make up stories for no reason. Suddenly, someone came up with an idea about how to save George. The neighbors ran around collecting buckets and bowls, and anything else they could use to remove some of the water and mud from the hole. That would let them see better and help Maria understand the hard surface she could feel beneath her feet. Slowly, it became clearer as more and more water was removed. Maria had told the neighbors about the hard surface, but she wasn't sure about what she was feeling. She hoped that it was something similar and that she hadn't made a mistake. But as the water and mud cleared out, Maria saw that she hadn't imagined anything at all. Other people jumped in to help remove water, and they agreed that there was something unusual about the bottom of the hole. With so many people working together, the water barely reached their knees. They were almost to the bottom, where they'd finally solved the mystery of what was going on with the hole. With others standing in the mud, Maria couldn't imagine that George was down there without one of them noticing. Someone would have noticed while they were moving around or bending down to fill their buckets with mud and water. Finally, they saw the hard surface of the hole's bottom. On the bottom of the mud pool, they found a hatch that George must have gone through. When they opened it up, they found that he had hidden a lot of stolen money. They called the police and had George arrested.